So what happened after the days of the New Testament? What happened to church music after, say, the year 70 AD? Well, as you probably know, in the year AD 70, Jerusalem was destroyed. The city was sacked. The temple was wiped out completely. And that really changed relationship between Jews and Gentiles. Well, think Judaism was completely changed around. The priesthood was no more. Animal sacrifices were no longer possible. If that's the case, then what happens to sins? How are sins atoned for if you have no Day of Atonement, if you have no priesthood? Anyway, Judaism became more spiritual and more prayer-oriented, and the model, the only thing that they had left was the synagogue. So they used the synagogue and gave up the temple. Judaism changed quite a bit. Increasingly, Christianity became viewed as Gentile, and Jews who had become Christians increasingly were considered to be apostate. So there in the year 70 was one of the diasporas of the Jews. The Romans took over the city, refused to let any Jewish person enter Jerusalem. They renamed the city Capitolina, and it was a totally pagan city. The Romans even had plans to build a pagan temple there where the temple of Yahweh had been. That didn't quite happen, but there were pagan temples throughout Capitolina, and an army garrison just to make sure that the Jews didn't make it back. So that's changing things, and changing things on a rather permanent basis. Well, in the meantime, Christians just in general were under persecution. Of course, they were under persecution from the Jews. They were under persecution from the Romans. So they didn't own buildings, and the arts aren't exactly going to flourish during that time. But poetry and song, that's something that can't be held down. So we do find some very rich texts from those early days, much more after 313 AD, but let's look at what we can of the early church after the New Testament, but before Constantine's conversion and the Edict of Milan in 313. What do we find? Pliny wrote to Trajan in the year 112, 115 AD, and he described a church service. Now, he tortured a couple of young virgins, he said, in order to get this information, but he felt pretty good about the accuracy of the information. So here's what he said that they did. They sang, in turn, songs of Christ as to a god. Interesting. They sang in turn. That probably means they were singing antiphonally. One group against the other, men and then women singing back and forth, perhaps a leader who had words and could then sing the songs and everybody responded. In any case, some form of antiphonal singing seemed to have been perhaps a very early thing in the church. Certainly, as we will see, it was practiced in other countries pretty early on. And they sang songs to Christ as to a god. They were very noticeably Christocentric, even to Pliny, that they would sing to Christ. And of course, as if he were divinity, which they believed that he was. So what do we know about the early church? Well, it was participative. The whole church seemed to have sung. Of course, we know from Paul's writing to the Corinthians that everybody came ready to participate. We know that it was lay-led, that they didn't have a paid worship leader, they didn't have an organist, it was just someone leading out with the songs. We know that it was antiphonal, and we also know that it was a very common thing for them to sing a jubilus. Jubilus. This was a wordless song. Perhaps it was the end of the word Alleluia, and the Yah would get stretched out. That was certainly the practice later when they started to write out Alleluias. That was this big, long, wordless song. Or it could have been just singing, nonsense syllables or humming or something like that. But in any case, sometimes the heart has so much joy that it can't be contained in words, and so we sing a Jubilus. I want to be clear and say that I believe there was a significant difference between Jewish churches and Gentile churches in this early day. When Paul started a church in Corinth, or especially in Galatia, he didn't necessarily have scriptures for them to read. He didn't necessarily have a synagogue model. They had only experienced the pagan model, and he had to leave sometimes after 3 weeks or 3 years and trust them to hear from the Holy Spirit and perhaps send a leader back there. But it wasn't to create another synagogue. It was to let them be whatever the culture was. And that's a pretty significant differentiation. On the other hand, in Jerusalem, there were many Jewish Christians in the early days. It was virtually all of them. So, of course, they would follow the synagogue patterns and readings and liturgy, and they would have the literature with them to read. Okay, so there was a difference between Jewish churches and Gentile churches, and yet what they all shared was Christ.